Hello and welcome, friends. I'm Dr. David Litwa, and I want to welcome you to the next session. Today we'll be talking about the next generation of Marcionites, and we are going to talk about that most famous of all the disciples of Marcion, a man named Apelles. There were others, namely Lucanus and Prepon. These other Marcionite leaders are mentioned in other sources, but what we know of them is so much less than what we know of Apelles. Apelles made a big impact in church history, so much so that Tertullian wrote a large work against Apelles and his followers, and Origen spent his time traveling from city to city in the East, battling Apelles and what Origen called his sect. So this was an extremely important, if not the most important, second generation Marcionite, and it shows that well into the 3rd century, Marcionite Christianity was strong because it had strong leaders, and Apelles is the most important example of them. So let us begin with some basic data. We know that Apelles was a direct disciple of Marcion, a direct disciple of the master, sometime between 140 and 160. We don't really know. Maybe in Rome, maybe somewhere else. We know that Marcion was settled in Rome for a period in the 130s and 140s. We don't know if he stayed there or sojourned in other locations. Whatever was the case, Apelles was his direct disciple and became his most famous disciple. And when Marcion died, probably around 160, Apelles, whether he came up with the idea himself or whether he was sent on a distinct mission, decided to go to the second great city in the Roman Empire, that is, the second most populous city in the Roman Empire, and to spread the gospel of the holy, good God. And he was there probably between 160 and 175. And Alexandria, it seems, opened up the eyes and the mind of Apelles so that he developed Marcionite thought in other directions, in deeper directions, in more philosophical directions, and in more Valentinian directions. Remember, this was the city of Valentinus, and there were other great Christian teachers in Alexandria teaching here right at this time, including Prodicus and Julius Cassianus. And a generation prior, you had also Carpocrates and Basilides, and probably during Apelles' time, we had Theodotus of Clement's excerpts from Theodotus. So there was a lot of things going on in Alexandria. And I haven't even mentioned the Nag Hammadi Alexandrian texts, which probably include the Gospel of Thomas. They include the Testimony of Truth. They include Eugnostus and probably the Wisdom of Jesus Christ. So go check out my book on early Christianity in Alexandria. At any rate, toward the end of his life, Apelles, now an old man, returns to Rome and is there until the end of the century. I say this probably happens about 180 because recall that Irenaeus writes his work against heresies or overthrow of gnosis, falsely so-called, about 180, and he doesn't seem to know anything about Apelles. So Apelles' entrance into Rome and his establishment of himself in Rome probably took place after Irenaeus wrote, so probably after 180. And there in Rome, Apelles debated with Rhodon, and Rhodon was a disciple of Tatian, and I'll mention the content of that debate a little later. So what happens when Marcionite Christianity, when the gospel of the holy good God meets other streams of Christian thought, which were dominant in Alexandria at the time, mainly here the Valentinian stream? Well, one of the things that Apelles clarifies for Marcionites is that God is one. Heresiologists often distorted Marcion's teaching by presenting it as ditheistic. And the great news about Apelles is he doesn't allow the heresiologists to pull that trick. So he says very firmly that God is one. It's in Marcion's scriptures. God is one. The faith is one. And by God, they mean the true God. So that means that the Creator is only a God in name only, a God who is named in an improper sense, what the Greeks called a categorized sense, a God who isn't really a God, but some sort of powerful intermediate being. And in fact, Apelles had a name for this being. He had a category for this being. The Creator was an angel, and a fiery angel, right? It says in the Hebrew Scriptures that the Lord is a consuming fire. He decides often to appear in fire. He appears in the burning bush, for instance. So he is himself an angel. And that's the basic category of an intermediate being. An angel is not a god, properly speaking. You could, improperly speaking, refer to this being as a god. Another way of saying this is that the Creator is a type of daimon, if you were thinking in more Greco-Roman terms. And one of the things that these daimones, or these intermediary beings, did sometimes is they tried to convince people, they tried to fool and trick people into thinking that they were the true and only God. And this is exactly what the Judean Lord did. But his untruths were exposed in Marcionite Christianity. He is, in fact, a fiery angel, entirely local, entirely tribal, and not universal. But one of the things that Apelles did say, and here he seems to have genuinely, as opposed to clarifying Marcion's teachings, he seems to have genuinely advanced them or gone in a different direction. Apelles did not say that the Creator or the Judean Lord was evil. He allowed there to be a third mediating category, that is justice. So again, Marcion himself thought more in terms of exposing the tyranny, the kind of false justice of the Creator as evil. But Apelles was willing to say that there is actually just one purely evil being, and that is the devil, or Satan. And that the Creator is not only ontologically intermediate, that is, something less than the true God, but more than human, he is also morally intermediate. In fact, the Creator, when he realizes that things aren't going according to plan, that he's not able to make creation go the way that he wants, and that people are dying, and that disease is rampant, he actually calls upon God to send Christ. And Christ is a superhuman Son of the true God. He does not need to be born. Apelles, who's in tune with philosophical currents, says that Christ, as we see in the Ascension of Isaiah, constructs his own body from the stars, a kind of astral or angelic body, and he fools the angels as he goes down heaven by heaven into thinking that he's one of them, but in fact he's not. And when he gets to earth, he creates a body from the four elements so that he has a genuinely human body, but that human body is perfect and it is unborn. And it's often the case that heresiologists will confuse the position of Apelles and Marcion. So they will say that for Marcion, Jesus was not born. But actually, this is the view of Apelles. And it's Apelles who uses that text in Marcion's Gospel, chapter 8, where the mother and brothers of Jesus come to him as he's speaking, and Jesus says, "Who are my mother and brothers?" Now, from Marcion's perspective, I think this is proof that Jesus had a physical mother and brother. But From Apelles, this is Jesus actually rejecting the idea that he had physical mothers and brothers. Jesus said that he did have other mothers and brothers, but they were mothers and brothers in the faith. So Christ had true flesh. It was not born, but it did truly suffer, and it did truly rise from the dead. But like a bird, when it breaks out of its shell, doesn't complain about the salvation or preservation of the shell, when the resurrected Jesus was ready to go to heaven, he, like Philo's Moses, relinquished his earthly mortal elements and went up as pure consciousness into the Empyrean. Even the heresiologists describe this woman, this female companion of Apelles, as an angel of God. Her name was Philomene, and she was a virgin as well as a prophetess. And we don't know exactly where she was. Most people assume that she was in Rome, so that when Apelles returned to Rome, he met her. And Apelles, surprisingly, was utterly fascinated by this woman, and he became her scribe, basically. He wrote down her revelations. Now, some say that because Apelles wrote down this book of new revelations, that he was trying to expand Marcion's canon. But I don't think that's really the case. I don't think that he presented these revelations as canonical. They were authoritative, they were important, they were communications from God, but they were not the sort of things that you read in a church service. And that's important to note, that Apelles is probably not expanding Marcion's canon, but he is promoting this woman's personal revelations in a book called Manifestations. And this woman was also known, Philomene was also known for miracles. Augustine mentions a miracle where she had this beaker, this glass beaker with a long neck, and she would have her daily bread put in this beaker. Basically, this is the way you preserve your food before Tupperware, I guess. So she was able, although it was physically impossible for most people, she was able to have this beaker, which had a wide bottom and a long neck, have her bread in the beaker, and with her fingers pull out the bread from the beaker. And this was incredible because the bread itself was physically too large to be forced out of the neck of the bottle. But I think, I'm not sure where this story comes from, actually. It could come from Tertullian, and Augustine is just repeating it. We don't really know. But I think, for me, as for most people, what's really miraculous about Philomene is her asceticism. It's a wonderful thing that she was able to pull out her bread from this beaker. But the more wonderful thing is she was able to survive on a single piece of bread every day. And that's really important for her. This woman gained authority and power because of her self-control, and that was a great way to earn respect and value in the ancient world. It's not at all valued today, but it was something extraordinary. And her self-discipline was extraordinary. That is absolutely the case. And I think Philomene, again, is one of those women who lives in the 2nd century. Nobody's really heard of her. That's the sad thing. But when people pick up the pastoral letters and they read verses like, "I don't allow a woman to speak in church, let her learn in silence," and that women are forbidden from speaking in the church services and forbidden from speaking their mind, their revelation. This is absolutely not the case. It's prescriptive advice. It's not descriptive advice. Philomene proves that female prophets, like we see in Corinth of the 1st century, were still active in the 2nd century, still active in Christian communities. And the fact that she has an influence on Apelles is so important for understanding Marcionite thought and the Marcionite openness toward prophecy, which is something that we also see in other movements of Christianity, such as Montanism and as well as Valentinian movements of Christianity. Anyway, remember this name, Philumene. Okay, now let's get back to Apelles. Apelles' magnum opus, something that he was best known for, is a book that Orthodox and early Catholic thinkers sought to destroy. And that was the book of syllogisms. This was a massive book. It had at least 38 books, which are, in modern language, very long chapters. And the point of this book was to show how the prophecies and narratives in the Hebrew Bible were not consistent, self-canceling, and unworthy of God. So we can see exactly how the syllogisms advance, perpetuate, and evolve the project of Marcion's antitheses. Marcion's antitheses were, it seems, fairly simple in their construction. As a book, the antitheses doesn't seem to be really propounding any sort of philosophical logic or dependent openly on a kind of philosophical argument. But the syllogisms was something different. They engaged the text of the Hebrew Bible, okay, very, very thoroughly on a commentary level with deep exegesis. And then they presented a critique of the logic and of the character of the Hebrew deity. And this book isn't preserved, but we have fragments of it, testimonies about it in Ambrose's book on Paradise and in other works. And this contains the first known criticism of Noah's Ark, where Apelles claims that, there's no way that they're going to fit every species of animal on this boat, and that, in terms of the metric dimensions, even though the boat is big, you couldn't have enough food on that boat to feed 4 elephants for more than a year. You just didn't have the space for it. And he actually calculated out the space, which is interesting. He also critiques a lot of what we find in the Garden of Eden narrative, which then feeds into Gnostic and later criticisms of the Garden of Eden story. So it was a really important book. The loss of it is absolutely tragic, but the echoes of it still reverberate today. So the last thing I want to talk about with regard to Apelles is his encounter or his debate with Rhodon. And this occurred when Apelles was back in Rome, sometime after 180. And I think that the debate really shows the heart of Apelles. The minutes of this debate are preserved in Eusebius's Ecclesiastical History. And Eusebius indicates that, it got kind of bitter and rancorous at points. And Rhodon himself says that he laughed at Apelles. He made fun of Apelles because Apelles couldn't prove his first principle. But then again, even Philo admitted that you can't prove your first principle. You have to assume your first principle and then build out from there. Apelles' response to Rhodon is that we can't know everything, but that we have to set our hope on the crucified one and do good works. And that is what makes Christians Christians. That is a belief in the narrative of the cross. And Rhodon, again, somewhat superciliously laughed at Apelles as not philosophically astute. But a man who wrote 38 books of syllogisms, deep commentary on the Hebrew Bible, was very, very philosophically informed. So that's not at all fair. And as often happens in debate, the rhetoric of taunting and of accusation sometimes drowns out the real truth. But I think this basic principle that Apelles reveals, that we set our hope on the crucified with good works, that's what makes Christians Christians. It's a way for him to overcome the heresiological rhetoric, which is always trying to find a way to delegitimate the beliefs of others and not trying to find common ground. And Apelles did try to find common ground with his fellow Christians. Okay, so for further reading on Apelles, there is some important work on Apelles. A lot of it, though, is done in French and German. So I won't list those articles here. If you are interested in that sort of material, you can let me know. But I've got two independent discussions of Apelles, one in my book, Found Christianities, page 226 and following, and then Early Christianity in Alexandria, 143 to 49. I would start here, and I'm interested in finding out what you think about this. So do comment and let me know. And if there's any other things that you want to discuss or talk about with regard to Apelles, please don't be afraid to leave a comment and a question, and I will endeavor to get back to you. Thank you so much to everybody, and take care.